The morning the world still looked normal. It smelled like ink and hot metal. Lower Manhattan woke with its usual swagger, the kind that made people walk faster than they needed to, like time itself was money and everyone was late to collect it. Streetcars rattled along rails slick with yesterday's rain. Shoes clicked in sharp rhythms. Newspapers slapped onto doorsteps and into hands. The headlines were full of numbers that sounded like destiny. Prices up, profits up, futures bright, printed so boldly they felt like promises you could fold and carry in your pocket. On the 20th floor of a building that pretended it could touch the clouds, Tom Mallory sharpened his pencil and watched men in stiff collars laugh as if the future had already been paid for. Tom was 28, slim, pale, his dark hair neatly parted, a small mustache like a careful underline on his upper lip. He rented a room that smelled faintly of cabbage and coal smoke. His shoes had been rezzled twice. Still, he'd been infected by the same fever as everyone else. The belief that the market only went one way, and anyone smart enough to stand near it would rise along with it. He wasn't alone. In Brooklyn, Elena Rossi, 24, olive-skinned, wavy black bob, green dress that looked more hopeful than expensive, set aside a few dollars from each week's sewing pay and handed them to a smiling man in a corner office. "It's like planting," he told her, leaning in as if sharing a secret about the universe. "But the harvest comes faster." In Ohio, Calvin Reed listened to the radio in his farmhouse kitchen and felt the strange sensation of being connected to distant things, as if a voice from New York could change the price of corn in his barn. In Detroit, James Jimmy Carter worked under harsh factory lights, his coveralls smeared with grease, watching a foreman pace and talk about orders like they were miracles. In Washington, officials studied charts and reports and convinced themselves that prosperity was proof the system was unbreakable. And for a while, it did look unbreakable. Then came the sound that didn't belong in a confident world, the sound of fear. At first, it arrived like a draft under a door. A few people sold, a few prices wobbled. Men who had joked yesterday frowned today. Someone stopped laughing mid-sentence. Someone else checked the ticker twice, as if it might apologize and correct itself. Tom watched the tape spill out in thin ribbons, watched the numbers twitch and stagger like a wounded animal. He could feel the mood, changing not with words, but with posture. Men leaning forward, hands tightening, voices sharpening, as if their edges could cut through panic. On a day that would later be remembered as if it had always been inevitable, the wobble became a fall. The fall became a drop. The drop became a cliff. Phones rang until ears ached. Messengers ran with slips of paper like they were carrying bandages for a city that was bleeding out. In the canyons of Wall Street, crowds pressed against buildings and shouted questions nobody could answer. Tom saw an important man, one of the untouchables, the kind who never seemed to sweat, wipe his forehead with trembling fingers. "Sell," someone yelled. "Sell everything." Another voice shouted, "Hold, hold," as if holding could stop gravity. Tom didn't even own much stock, but fear is democratic. It visits everyone. It whispered to the clerks and doormen and secretaries, "If the big men are frightened, what happens to us?" By the end of that terrible week, the country had lost more than numbers. It had lost certainty. At first, people tried to pretend nothing essential had changed. A crash, they told themselves, was like a storm. It passed. The sky cleared. You swept up broken branches and went back to work. But this storm didn't pass. It stayed. It moved in like an unwanted relative and made itself comfortable. In small banks across the country, depositors arrived with tense faces and tight hands. They asked for their money not because they needed it that hour, but because they suddenly wanted to see it, wanted proof it still existed. Bankers smiled too widely. Of course, they said. No problem. But they began to stare at their ledgers the way a doctor stares at a patient's chart before delivering bad news. The problem with a bank is that it looks like a building full of money, but it isn't. It's a building full of promises. As long as people believe, the promises work. When belief cracks, the building becomes a stage for panic. In Cleveland, Calvin's cousin stood outside a bank for 2 hours in cold wind. The line behind him thickened like a bruise. He watched the teller's face drain as the drawer emptied. When his turn came, he asked for his savings, small, hard-earned. The teller counted bills with fingers that would not stop shaking. Calvin heard about it days later and felt a hard knot form in his stomach. Because when a bank trembles, farms tremble too. In New York, Tom walked past the stock exchange and saw the crowd still there, as if grief had taken physical form and refused to leave. Men stared upward like prayers might arrive from windows. Rumors outran truth. Suicide stories multiplied. Some real, some invented, because the public needed tragedies dramatic, enough to match what it felt. Elena lost her job when orders vanished. The shop owner called the women together and tried to speak like a father, but his voice cracked like an old chair. "I'm sorry," he said again and again. "There's no work." Elena walked home with her sewing kit like it was a dead thing. She passed storefronts with "for rent" signs and men standing idle with nowhere to go. In Detroit, Jimmy's factory slowed. The lines that used to roar now coughed. Shifts were cut. Men began counting hours like crumbs. Jimmy brought home half the pay he used to, and his wife's eyes learned a new kind of math in silence, calculating how long they could survive on less. Their children learned to stop asking for extra. Scarcity trained them the way school never had. The government watched and hesitated like someone standing at the edge of deep water, afraid to jump. President Herbert Hoover believed in self-reliance and the strength of private charity. He believed the economy would correct itself if people remained calm, if businesses cooperated, if confidence returned. "Prosperity is just around the corner," he had said, and the phrase became a cruel joke. Corners came and went. Prosperity did not. As months turned into years, the damage spread like ink in water. Factories closed. Mines shut down. Railroads reduced routes. Farmers, already squeezed by years of low crop prices, were hit by collapsing demand. In the Great Plains, the land itself began to betray its people. Years of aggressive plowing had broken the grass roots that held the soil. Then drought arrived, like a punishment nobody had ordered, but everybody suffered. When the wind blew, it lifted the earth into the air. One afternoon, Calvin stood on his porch in Kansas and watched the horizon darken. At first, he thought it was a storm. Then he realized the storm was soil. The sky became a moving wall. Dust poured into cracks, under doors, into lungs. He tied a cloth around his face and ran to the barn. But dust was everywhere, turning day into dusk. His wife wiped the table, and the dust returned before her hand reached the sink. Their youngest, Ruth, began keeping a small jar by her bed, watching it fill, night after night, as if it were evidence the outside could always reach in. In cities, hunger became a regular visitor. Soup kitchens formed long lines. Men who used to wear suits stood beside men who had never owned one, holding tin cups with the same embarrassed posture. Shantytowns rose on empty lots made of scrap wood, metal sheets, and hope hammered thin. People called them Hoovervilles, a bitter nickname that turned suffering into accusation. Tom lost his job when his firm collapsed. One day he was a clerk with a future. The next he was a man walking streets with a folded newspaper under his arm, circling want ads like a ritual. But there were too many men and too few jobs. Employers could demand anything. Men took positions beneath their skills because pride did not pay rent, Some didn't find work at all. Tom learned that waiting could become a profession. Waiting outside offices for rumors. Waiting at relief stations for stamps and forms. Waiting for the mail, like it might carry a miracle. Elena moved into a smaller room with her sister. They shared meals that grew plainer by the week. Elena sewed at home, fixing hems for neighbors in exchange for coins or food. She learned which shops threw out day-old bread. She learned how to make a pot of soup taste like something more with a single onion. She learned that poverty is not only about money, it is about shrinking choices until life becomes a narrow hallway and every door is locked. Across the country, anger rose, but it rose alongside shame. People blamed themselves first. What had they done wrong? Then they looked outward. Bankers, politicians, foreigners, fate, the weather, the modern world, anything that made the pain feel less random. By 1932, the nation was exhausted. It wasn't only an economic crisis anymore. It was a crisis of spirit. Trust, that invisible glue holding society together, began to dissolve. That year, a new figure stepped forward with a voice that sounded like motion. Franklin Delano Roosevelt campaigned with an energy that seemed almost rude in a time of despair. He spoke about a New Deal for the American people, words simple enough to fit on a poster, heavy enough to carry a promise. The government would not stand aside while citizens starved. Roosevelt didn't pretend pain could vanish overnight. Instead, he offered something even more dangerous and necessary, the idea that action was possible. Tom heard Roosevelt through a boarding house radio, surrounded by men too tired to clap but not too tired to listen. Elena heard him through a neighbor's set, the sound tinny but the message clear. Jimmy listened in Detroit and felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, not certainty, but direction. Out in Kansas, Calvin heard the voice through static, like a man calling from far away, and he leaned closer as if the words could warm his hands. Roosevelt won in a landslide. The country didn't just vote for a man, it voted against paralysis. When Roosevelt took office in March 1933, he inherited a nation in free fall. Banks were collapsing so quickly, people feared money itself might disappear. Some states declared bank holidays, temporary closings, to prevent runs. It was like locking doors while the house burned. Roosevelt moved with the urgency of someone who understood that delay was its own kind of violence. He declared a national bank holiday, shutting down banks to stop panic and give the government time to inspect and stabilize them. The decision terrified some and relieved others. It was drastic, but the moment demanded drastic things. Then he did something that seemed small compared to laws and banking systems, but it mattered. He spoke to the public as if they were adults who deserved to understand. In his first fireside chat, his voice entered living rooms with calm intimacy. He explained what had happened and what would happen next. He asked for faith, not blind faith, but faith based on a plan. When banks reopened, many people returned their hoarded cash to deposit. Trust did not fully return, but it stepped back from the cliff. That was only the beginning. The New Deal was not one program. It was a flood. Agencies, experiments, laws, built from the belief that federal power had to expand to meet a disaster of national scale. To critics, it looked like dangerous overreach. To the hungry, it looked like a door finally opening. Tom heard about the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, young men hired to plant trees, build trails, fight erosion. He wasn't a teenager, but he saw the relief on their faces, uniforms, meals, small paychecks sent home like lifelines. He watched them march and realized employment wasn't only money. It was structure, routine, pride stitched back into days. Elena heard rumors of work relief, sewing projects, public work, government checks that might keep families afloat. She didn't care what the letters stood for. She cared that the line moved. One day she stood in a long queue at an office where tired clerks handed out forms. The line moved slowly, but it moved. That alone felt like progress. In Detroit, union activity rose as workers demanded better wages, safer conditions, the right to bargain collectively. The New Deal created an atmosphere where government seemed less likely to crush labor automatically. Jimmy attended a meeting in a smoky room and listened to men talk about solidarity. He had spent years thinking survival was an individual contest. Now he heard a different idea. Survival could be shared. Out in Kansas, Calvin learned about programs meant to stabilize farm prices and keep families on their land. Farmers were proud. Taking help felt like admitting failure. But dust didn't care about pride, and drought didn't negotiate. When the government offered payments for soil conservation, changes that could keep the earth from blowing away, Calvin took it, partly out of need and partly out of stubborn love for his farm. The Roosevelt administration attacked the crisis from several angles, fixing finance so banks wouldn't collapse as easily, offering relief for the hungry and unemployed, boosting recovery by putting people to work, and building long-term security, so one accident, old age, or job loss wouldn't automatically destroy a family. In the middle of it all was a shift in belief. The federal government was no longer just a referee on the sidelines. It stepped onto the field and began taking responsibility for keeping the country from falling apart. Not everyone liked that. Some business leaders called Roosevelt a traitor to capitalism. Conservatives warned America was sliding toward socialism. Liberals argued he still wasn't going far enough. The Supreme Court struck down early New Deal programs, and Roosevelt pushed back, adjusted, and tried again, like building a raft while already in deep water. On the ground, the New Deal felt uneven, like a quilt stitched while worn. Some programs helped certain groups more than others. Some excluded people entirely, especially where racial and regional inequalities were already built in. Still, for millions, it meant one clear thing. The government had answered the knock at the door. Tom signed up for public works and waited. Weeks later, he was handed a shovel, instructions, and a paycheck that felt like dignity returning. His hands blistered fast, but he wrapped them and kept going. One night he brought home meat, for the first time in months, not rich, just upright. Elena found work through a sewing project making uniforms and supplies. The room was filled with women bent over machines, the steady stitching like rain. They spoke softly about missing husbands, hungry children, and landlords threatening eviction. Roosevelt's voice on the radio didn't erase fear, but it pushed fear back enough for Elena to breathe. Jimmy joined workers demanding fair treatment and watched labor's world change. He saw strikes, police lines, anger, and solidarity. He witnessed sit-down strikes, workers occupying factories to block replacements. When victories came, they arrived quietly. Signatures, concessions, exhausted men walking home a little taller. Calvin watched the dust keep coming because policy couldn't summon rain. But he also saw changes: contour plowing, tree windbreaks, conservation plans that treated soil as something to protect. Government men arrived with clipboards and advice. Some farmers cursed them, some welcomed them. Calvin did both, depending on the day. Still, many families couldn't hold on. Drought, dust, and debt forced them off farms. People packed trucks and headed west toward California, chasing rumors of work. Calvin watched neighbors drive away, children staring at their homes like something they were leaving behind forever. Letters came from relatives out west, sunlight and orchards at first, hope in every line. Then came overcrowded camps, fierce competition for field jobs, resentment from locals, and hunger. The West had been a rumor of salvation. Rumors don't have to keep promises. In cities, Tom saw men fight for day work like starving animals. He saw old men selling apples just to feel useful. He saw women patch clothes until fabric turned thin and shiny. Survival became a daily contest, and dignity was something you had to defend. He also saw art where he didn't expect it. On a post office wall, a huge mural showed workers, farmers, trains, and fields. At first he felt angry. How could anyone paint while people begged? Then he felt seen. The New Deal wasn't only shovels and checks, it was also a message that ordinary lives mattered. Through the mid-1930s, the nation changed shape. Dams rose. Electricity reached rural darkness, and roads and bridges spread like veins. Writers and artists were employed too, building culture alongside concrete. Regulations aimed to prevent another financial suicide, and deposit insurance reduced bank-run panic. In 1935, Social Security took form. For the first time, the federal government built a wide system to support the elderly and provide unemployment insurance. It wasn't perfect and didn't cover everyone equally, but it carried a radical idea. Being old or unlucky should not mean being abandoned. Tom's landlady cried when she heard. "Maybe I won't end up in the poorhouse," she said. Elena thought of her parents and felt a small relief. Jimmy imagined aging without terror. Calvin, who rarely trusted distant promises, gave a cautious nod. Recovery came in waves, not a straight line. In 1937, the economy stumbled again. Spending tightened, unemployment rose, factories hesitated. It felt like being pulled backward after years of crawling forward. Worry returned to voices, and the fragile sense of safety shook. Roosevelt fought another battle too. Angry at Supreme Court resistance, he proposed adding justices. Critics called it court packing. Supporters saw a practical solution. Others saw dangerous overreach. The backlash reminded Americans that a strong government can help, but it can also harm if unchecked. Beyond America's borders, a different darkness gathered. Dictators rising, marching boots, promises of pride in exchange for obedience. After World War I, many Americans wanted isolation, believing foreign wars were traps. They said, "We have enough problems here," and they did. But history rarely stays contained. As 1939 approached, the mood was cautious recovery mixed with lingering fear. Some people had work, many didn't. Some rebuilt homes, others lived in shacks. Hope existed, but so did bitterness, and the memory of hunger remained close. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and war erupted in Europe. Radios carried urgent voices, and newspapers printed maps. Even Americans who wanted distance felt the shift. One crisis was still here, and another was arriving. Yet the Depression had already strengthened the nation in one way. It taught America how to mobilize, coordinate, and act at a huge scale. Skills developed to fight unemployment and hunger would soon be used under harsher pressure and higher stakes. One night, Tom walked past a construction site where men finished a bridge. Steel beams rose into dark air like ribs. The smell of wet earth and oil mixed with cold. Bright lamps turned faces into moving masks of concentration. Tom leaned on a fence and watched bolts tightened. And he thought about breadlines, about invisibility, about the way government had grown because the crisis had been larger than private charity could hold. Elena sat at her small table with tea and fabric scraps. She survived by turning scarcity into routine and learning the hard art of adaptation. She wasn't romantic about it, only certain that endurance could be its own quiet victory. Jimmy watched his children sleeping and realized they had grown up treating struggle as normal. He didn't want that life for them. Still, the decade had planted something stubborn in him. The belief that ordinary people could demand dignity, and sometimes win. Calvin stepped outside after a long day and studied the sky. Some nights it was clear with stars. Some nights dust hung in the air even without wind. He didn't know what was coming, only that the old assumptions were gone, because the land and the nation had learned the same lesson. Neglect has consequences. The Great Depression did not end in one bright, triumphant moment. It faded unevenly, leaving scars in families and habits. People saved string, reused jars, and feared waste, as if waste could summon poverty again. And the New Deal, with all its flaws and arguments, left something permanent: the expectation that government has responsibilities in a modern society. Americans would keep debating how far those responsibilities should go. But after the 1930s, it became harder to argue that Washington should simply watch while the nation collapsed. By the end of the decade, America stood with one foot on recovery and the other on the edge of a new world crisis. The story wasn't finished. It was changing chapters without warning, the way life always does. And somewhere in the noise of radios and factories and wind, the country kept moving, scarred, arguing, building, because stopping had never been an option.